Dr. Kristina Hill gets her slides queued up, I have the pleasure of introducing her. Um, I'm so excited that she's joining us tonight, and we're going to hear more about her work on coastal adaptation with her talk, Adaptation Pathways, Where to Start and How to Get Where You Want to Go. Kristina's work ties into our local work on coastal resiliency in West Marin. And just as a reminder, we will be recording this portion of the talk in particular and uploading it to our coastal climate webinar series so that we can share it with others. Please enter any questions you might have in the chat box. We're going to have time for a question and answer at the end of the session. I'll also probably be able to take some raised hands. And I'm also going to be putting some relevant papers that Kristina has shared with us in the chat during the talk. I want to just say a little bit about Kristina. She is an associate professor of landscape architecture, environmental planning, and urban design at UC Berkeley. She's the director of UC Berkeley's Institute of Urban and Regional Development, and she teaches courses on resilience and adaptation to climate change. I wish I could take some of those classes. They sound super interesting. She speaks all over the world, and her perspective on resilience was developed through research and applied projects in coastal Germany, the Netherlands, Seattle, Provincetown, Massachusetts, New York, South Bronx, and New Orleans, as well as the Bay Area. And she received her PhD from Harvard and has found ways to be pro-housing and pro-biodiversity in a changing world. That's no easy feat. Yeah, and without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Kristina.
Great. Well, thank you. And thanks for giving me a chance to talk to you all about adaptation pathways, which I summarize as the art of getting from here to there when you don't want to go. It's not an easy thing to adapt to conditions that are not the ideal conditions. And I just wanted to remind everyone, the reason we're having this conversation about adaptation pathways and need to talk to a lot of other people about it is because we've already changed the planet so much. So we're really waiting for the other shoe to drop. If you look at this kind of graph, you can see how we haven't been here before, or at least not while humans have been alive. And we're in a whole new planet in some ways, and that's what we need to adapt to. I'll just say quickly that the state of California has offered us guidance through OPC in 2018 about what sea level rise scenarios we should be considering. And these have to inform our adaptation pathways. And for projects that are low risk aversion, they're talking about 3.4 feet by 2100. High risk aversion, as much as almost 7 feet by 2100. And of course, the possibility of 10.2 feet by 2100. And hopefully we're not going to go there, but we need to watch what's happening in places like Glasgow next week and see if we're making any progress. Otherwise, we need to take those bigger numbers much more seriously. So I'm here to talk about adaptation pathways. I want to give you a little bit of a sense of what is an adaptation pathway. And the best analogy I have is that it's like choosing stepping stones for crossing a stream. You look at the situation. This is a Hawaiian stream. You look at the situation, you assess what's coming, what are your possible stepping stones, and then you choose a path. And we don't always do that consciously. A lot of us just seem to fling ourselves out there, but the more careful people really do look at the stones and decide which is the best pathway. Maybe you're not wearing the shoes you want to get wet. Anyway, what we need to do with adaptation pathways is consider the alternatives and make sure we have a wide range of options for how we might do our adaptation as we go and not get too focused on one strategy too quickly. And when planners represent these pathways, they show boxes and arrows. And one of the things you'll notice about this diagram, which comes from work on the Thames River in around London, is that there's no time on it. So adaptation pathways are usually presented independently of time so that we can get out of that argument about when sea level is going to reach a certain magnitude and instead talk about, if it does, what will we do? And what they've done here is arrayed a whole set of stepping stones. How would they alter the flood defenses for the City of London and that whole region? And you can see there are various options about barriers and flood storage, and it's a river floodplain landscape, so it's not exactly like the ocean coast, but the bottom one is the new, as they say, barrage, which we would call a dam. It's basically a barrier that doesn't open. But the green line with the arrow shows a pathway across the stepping stones. And as they look at that pathway, they could talk about how to optimize it. They could look at different alternative pathways. And we might have a diagram that had multiple pathways on it. And then we could compare the costs, social costs, environmental impacts, as well as capital costs or maintenance costs for these different pathways. So that's what this is really about. It's about looking at strategies independent of time and being able to think about what our options are in a wide array. We try to make the biggest mosaic of choices that we can. The question of how we would like to adapt in California, obviously that's what I mostly work on, and I'm sure that's something that's interesting to you. I just want to remind everyone this is not optional, and that conventional development is going to start to fail. So if it was optional, we would choose not to do it. Not optional. This is what a potential adaptation pathway chart might look like for the San Francisco Bay, based on the alternatives that I've been talking about with people at BCDC and other cities. And you can see feet of sea level rise are right on the top. One option is to pursue living shorelines, wetlands, and to embrace the idea of retreat, because those wetlands need to be able to move through transitions as sea level rises, or they would collapse to mudflats. So we have to allow those wetlands to be within the intertidal zone. So that top set of boxes represents a kind of environmental approach to adaptation where we would pull back urban development and ranches and other kinds of development and allow wetlands to move inland and up. That would be great for a lot of people. This is their stored wetland at Corte Madera. A lot of us would like to see that, but it involves a lot of choices. The other options you all are talking about are things like this. This is the sand engine in the Netherlands at Rotterdam, where they out of sand and actually found that the sand, as it was dewatering, they piled up wet sand from dredge. As it was dewatering, it actually changed the direction of groundwater and caused the groundwater to flow backwards towards the land instead of out towards the sea, which is its normal gradient route. So they had to put in a line of pumps to be able to stop that, or the town back here would have watched its water supply contaminated. So we have to be very careful about what we do and think about pilot projects before we do big scale. So the problem with these adaptation pathways is it's not a one-time thing. You don't make one decision and then stop. You have to make multiple decisions as you pass through different threshold elevations of both the mean tide and the groundwater. And what can happen is that people may commit to a strategy that makes sense for biodiversity and human health and property. And then as the pressure increases on people to give up land, they may switch over to a gray strategy instead of a green strategy, or some kind of hybrid where it goes from wetlands to being horizontal levees or wetland levees. And then the levees get wider and wider, and then the wetlands start to drop out. Or another alternative, which I'll talk about in a minute, which is thinking about constructing ponds in what's now dry land as the groundwater rises. And I'll show you a picture of that in just a minute. But these pathways change as pressure increases on decision makers. And that's what we have to be prepared for. We might find ourselves having more and more pressure to build walls, which of course is going to make it very difficult to sustain a beach or a wetland once property owners start to go in this direction. And we have a poll. In fact, we have two questions we are going to ask. And I think Ashley was going to do a poll.
I will launch it. I'm going to launch question 1 here. Can you guys see that? Okay, so this is do you see the impacts of rising sea levels as a problem shared by all members of coastal communities, a problem that primarily affects coastal property owners, a problem that primarily affects the tourism recreation industry? So I'm going to let this run till we get to about 80%. almost there. Okay, I'm going to end the poll. And can you guys see the results? So it looks like 96% of you shared by all members of the coastal community.
That's great, because that changes your options if you see it that way. That means that more people will be willing to participate in coming up with a strategy. It's much better to be in that condition than to be in a situation where most people think it only affects tourism or it only affects coastal property owners. Do you want to do the second poll question while we're at this pause, and then we'll do the last one at the end?
I will launch that one.
Thank you.
All right, so this one is, what do you think is the best way to pay for coastal change, whether it includes adaptation in place, building road relocation, or ecosystem investments? So this would be all public tax dollars, all private responsibility, private property owners, a mix of public and private investment, or others, and you can share those in the chat. And we'll let this one run for a few seconds here and get up to about 80%.
And it is anonymous, so you can really tell us what you think.
This is a really interesting question, so I'm curious what the responses here will be. And I don't get to vote. Okay, I'm going to end the poll and share results. You guys see that? So it's like 86%, a mix of public and private, with 10% of all public and 3% of other. And I don't know, did anyone put anything in the chat? No, that's okay. But nobody said private responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting.
That's great. Well, of course, we're all dependent on those coastal ecosystems for our health and food resources and everything else. So I think this audience seems pretty sophisticated about that. These questions don't always have so much consensus. So I'll go on if you want to turn that poll off.
Is it off? I can't tell. Did it turn off? Okay.
I think people can close the window.
Okay, perfect.
So let me talk about how this gets more difficult now that I know that you're an audience that's ready to hear what's more difficult. The problem is, in part, that coastal groundwater is rising with seawater. And they're normally in equilibrium, right? The freshwater groundwater is flowing out to the sea. And I'm talking about the kind of groundwater that's shallow and unconfined, talking about the stuff right on the surface that you would find if you dug down at the beach, that stuff. That's the groundwater that's rising, not the deeper stuff that's below a layer that's impermeable. So we're talking about the saturated zone of the soil. And in a coastal area, this freshwater groundwater drains out towards the sea, and you can see the sea is a little higher. The water table line is usually assumed to be a tiny bit above mean sea level or mean tide level. And the sea, of course, rises above and below that with the tides. And then there's a zone of dispersion in an area where that groundwater is salty. And as the sea rises, that whole saltwater zone, it's like a toe underneath the land. It's going to go under the land and push the freshwater groundwater up, like it's a toe on the couch pushing up a pillow. And that's how we end up with a new equilibrium level, whereas the sea rises, the freshwater groundwater also rises. And if that didn't happen, saltwater would come in and be a saltwater layer on top of the freshwater. So it's good that it happens in terms of keeping our freshwater groundwater for as long as possible. This is a paper that came out in 2016 that looked at Stinson Beach in terms of groundwater levels. And what you can see looking at it is in the top rectangle, they show existing conditions. In B, they show sea level rise. I'm sorry, that's existing conditions in 2011 in B. They're just not showing the groundwater contours. In C, they're showing 1 meter of sea level rise, and the red shows areas where groundwater is within a meter of the surface. And then in D, they're showing 2 meters of sea level rise, and you can see that almost all of the sand there is saturated. So wet sand doesn't hold the same angle of repose. As everything gets saturated, and of course wave dynamics increase, that's why our shorelines are going to be so altered, because water is rising up from below as well as moving in from the sides. I use this cartoon to try to explain that to people about how urban areas are affected. And you can see the freshwater groundwater in this lighter blue, the saltwater groundwater, that toe poking underneath in the darker blue, and that as it comes up, sewer pipes can fill with water. Creeks and flood zones can see more flooding just from the groundwater eventually. And any kind of pollution left in the soil from old dry cleaners or gas stations, never mind Superfund sites, all of that becomes part of a toxic soup because it's capped from above, but not from below. Also landfills. Most of them are capped on the top, but not lined below. And this groundwater finds its way inexorably as water, as you know, finds its level. And it's going to move eventually through everything. It's got nothing but time to find its way to move up. So some people like the Dutch are working more on floating urban districts. And this is something we'll be talking about here in the Bay Area. All of the units, all of these units in the middle of this triangle are floating. And all of these on the dike here have conventional foundations. In the Bay Area, we'll be able to do the floating, but we may not be able to do the conventional foundations because we're seismically active, and the risk of liquefaction and violent shaking increases as groundwater tables move up. So buildings are going to get a lot more expensive to build if we build foundations much deeper to be ready for that increased risk of liquefaction. And we proposed thinking about how to do this in the Bay Area. And I wanted to show you this just because it shows floating housing on the inside of a big wetland. This was proposed for East Palo Alto. It's not that we would float houses on the bay. That would be terrible. That would be bad for habitat, bad mix of things, waves, all that stuff, not good. But putting it on the inland side that's currently dry and will soon have a higher groundwater, that could make some sense with wetlands on the outside. So if we think about that kind of option and we look at adaptation pathways, we might start out with living shorelines and wetlands. And as we get ready, we might prepare by, in urban areas, doing more of these ponds with floating urban districts. Some of the ponds could be habitat, some of them could be recreation, some of them could be housing. It's a mix, but we might find ourselves in a different pathway. And we could have wetlands still on the outside of that if we can find a way to do it. So how do you adapt a complex landscape? These are all different pictures of how we might adapt, but when you're looking at adaptation pathways, when you really know your local area, and this is Marin City, you have to start element by element. So Highway 101, that's going to have a strategy, and that strategy is going to change Marin City's options. So whatever's on the edge changes the options for things that are farther in. The mall there at the Gateway Mall will have options driven by what happens to 101. Donahue Street will have options driven by what happens to 101 and the mall. And then all the affordable housing in Marin City will have options driven by what happens to Donahue. So it's like dominoes in a way. Each element needs to be projected forward. And that means that government jurisdictions have to collaborate on what it is they're going to decide for these different elements. If 101 is elevated, the mall floods. If it's elevated on a causeway, if it's elevated on a berm of earth, the mall doesn't flood with salt water, but it floods with rainwater. So there are lots of options here, and we'll need to work together to figure out how this mosaic actually is going to be adapted. And the more you know about your local area, the more you know what the elements are. So I'll just close by saying a lot of people ask when we need to start. There's been a lot of delay already. The British look at it in a very British way as a diagram that to them represents they call it the wicket diagram, like in croquet. And this is their wicket diagram. They say track what's happening with a variable like sea level rise over time. You have to make a decision at a certain point because there's a lead time for planning and construction. And if you don't make the call at a certain point, you won't be ready when sea level reaches a threshold where conventional development starts to fail. or where people's land starts to wash into the ocean. So there's lead time. This is the main point of this diagram. When we look at the past, my background's in geology, so I always look at the last 10,000, 20,000 years. You can see that there have been periods of very rapid sea level rise in the past. And this last 8,000 year period has been relatively stable, almost no change. And that's when the world's deltas formed, because the shoreline was stable and rivers dumped their sediment load in the same location for 8,000 years. That's when cities were invented, during the era of very, very slow sea level rise. We are effectively in the last relatively stable 30 years of an 8,000 year period. And it doesn't even seem that stable right now, given the whole COVID thing and the possibility of new COVID things and atmospheric river events. So it doesn't even seem that stable, but the time to try pilot projects and evaluate them is absolutely now, because 20 years from now, 25, everything hits the fan and the rate of sea level rise accelerates because it's exponential, and it will never be this easy to plan ever again in the future. So if it seems hard now, it's going to be much harder later. We should be doing all the pilot projects that we can and evaluating them. And I'll close on that. It's sort of a call to arms. See what people's questions are.
Thank you so much, Kristina. This was such an interesting presentation. If anyone has a question, please put it in the chat, or you can also raise your hand and I can call on people. I can also start with, I thought of a few questions of my own. Let's see, I'm not seeing raise hands at the moment or questions in the chat. Probably everyone's just absorbing all this information. I guess bringing it back to West Marin, this is kind of a broad question, but I'll just throw it at you. I guess what might be an example of an adaptation pathway solution or a pilot project for West Marin? Is there anything that comes to mind? I know that's a pretty loose, broad question.
Yeah,
but...
sure. Well, piling up sand at Stinson Beach and other coastal areas is a real option. We have to think about where that sand comes from, and whether piling up wet sand will have any negative impacts we have to also plan for. But the Dutch have had a positive experience with the sand engine. They feel that the wind and waves have taken that lump of sand and distributed it over a larger part of their coastline. Mm-hmm. And they feel it's worked well. Now, every coastline is a little bit different amounts of sediment transport, different wave regimes. So we'd have to figure out whether that would work, but I understand that's a possible alternative that people are looking at for Stinson Beach and potentially other beach areas. In Tomales Bay, you've got wetlands. You certainly could allow those wetlands to move upland. There are developed areas that could start floating in excavated ponds. It sounds like science fiction, but this is all very realistic for what's coming next. So developed areas will start to fail. And when they start to fail, because sanitary sewer lines are full of water, a seismic event comes along and you see building failures, collapses, then people will say, okay, what's next? And if we've planned ahead, we'll be ready for what we might have for options. And if we haven't, then it's each property owner on his or her own.
Right.
And unfortunately, because of groundwater rise, levees and seawalls won't prevent flooding. That's a very important thing to know. I didn't really stress that. But if we build a levee on Tomales Bay at the end down by, White House Pool and all of that, it won't stop the water from rising behind the levee because the groundwater will continue to rise. So you'd have to actually pump, and then the land starts to sink. Living with the higher water is a much better strategy than getting into the destructive strategies that lead to subsidence.
Right. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for those responses. Yeah, and I know that there is a Stinson Beach Dunes feasibility study that recently came out, so I can grab some links to that and put that in the chat. I also noticed that we had a few kind of, I think, other responses after the poll where, let's see, Someone had or Allison had mentioned if private dollars are involved, then there must be laws governing or regarding how those efforts are governed. And someone else kind of had a +1 on that. So yeah, definitely a lot of tough questions and things to think about.
Yeah, we've definitely seen on Cape Cod in Massachusetts, where there are wealthy people living on Nantucket Island. They've thrown money at strategies like geotubes full of sand that have not worked. And then in Malibu Beach, we've seen homeowners try strategies like riprap walls to protect septic fields, and the broad beach has gotten real skinny as a result of that riprap. So we've seen people throw their own money at solutions that don't really work and actually degrade the ecosystems.
Right. Yeah, no, that's definitely a hard part about planning. I mean, we can come up with ideas, but then if they're infeasible or too costly, then that's problematic. And Bridger Mitchell has a question he asked, and related to what you're just talking about. What pilot options might be considered for septic systems that will be inundated? We do have quite a few septic systems out at the coast here.
Right. There's been a lot of work on that for Hawaii because their septic systems are already inundated by higher than normal tides. And also Rhode Island is looking at alternatives for septic. Basically, people are going to have to go to some kind of packaged sewage treatment or composting toilets.
Yeah,
And, in fact, if you've had a septic field for more than 15 years, it's already probably not working.
yeah. Maintenance is a big part of that, and interesting thinking about new ideas like composting toilets and what is also allowed under our current regulatory structure. And sometimes some of those options aren't necessarily even an option yet.
Right. I mean, they probably used that to limit development in part, right? Because people would have said, oh, I don't need a sewer line or a septic field. I'll just have a composting toilet. But now it's going to be existing development that needs to switch.
Right, right. Yeah, that's different. Let's see. Sarah Miller says, speak about interactions of erosion and sea level rise and how this might accelerate sea level rise, thinking of Gleason Beach and the cliffs in Sonoma County.
Well, I'll tell you the truth about bluff erosion. There's nothing that works that we've found so far. So we're in a live with it mode on bluff erosion, and that means we're going to lose some coastal roads and coastal sewage lines and things like that follow the roads. There just hasn't been nothing that works. People have thrown concrete at it, rock, sand-filled tubes. Nothing has worked yet. The waves win. So that's a tough one. And the erosion dynamics for sand at places like Stinson Beach, it may be that the rate of erosion is higher than, is too high for what amount of sand people want to invest in placing. It's kind of like putting a little pile of sand on the windshield of your car and turning the wipers on. You put it there at great expense and then boom, it's gone. That may not feel worth it to people. So you have to know your sediment transport rates, and changes in wave regimes are going to drive those higher.
Those are all very good points. And where does the sand get end up after you place it? Does it, disrupt other ecosystems? Let's see, Leslie added, we will likely need to reroute our transportation corridors inland as our shoreline roadways become inundated regularly. Yeah, which was kind of what you were just talking about. And then Lisa has a question. She says, can you speak to wells? Must they be drilled deeper or are they okay, I guess, as is?
Well, a well that's shallow is going to look like it's producing more fresh water for a while. So people will actually see more production from wells initially, and then that water will eventually be saline. So first there's a party, everybody has more water, and then it's very sad. So you just need to be aware of that if it looks good for a while, eventually it will be salty, and you have to decide whether to drill deeper below an aquiclude to find fresh water. I don't know what the depth of that would be in West Marin, or whether you're going to continue to try to use local water and do some kind of desalinization, which is super expensive and produces a pretty nasty brine that has to be disposed of. No easy answers there.
Yeah, there's a lot of wells out here and definitely already dealing with saltwater intrusion issues. So these are good things
If
to
you've
know.
already seen the salt in the well, then there's going to be no party. I mean, it's already the beginning of the saltwater tow coming up to the well bottom.
Let's see. I have a question kind of related to that, a little bit more broad, but I mean, is there really anything we can do now to prepare for groundwater rise? I mean, we know it's coming. I know that there's been some really great modeling done. We actually had a talk with some of your colleagues as part of our coastal climate webinar series in the fall that spoke about some of the new groundwater rise research. And I imagine we want to at least incorporate some of that modeling into our planning, but is there anything else we can do?
Well, it can be pumped. And if one of those authors, Kevin Beefus, and I have been talking about the possibility that light, shallow pumping might help people keep their homes in place for longer. And in places, in urban places, most of the stormwater pipes and sanitary sewer pipes are already cracked. So what I was saying was, what if you put a pump at the downhill end of your storm sewer system and use your cracked pipes as if they're a perforated pipe drainage network? And then you actually could maybe keep your groundwater lower for a while. So we kind of need to shave the peak for a couple of decades, keep the groundwater low enough that we can stay in place, buy ourselves some time to build whatever it is we're going to build, or to pull it all out of the ground and back up. So there may be ways to pump lightly, but if people try to put a deep well and pump from that a whole big area, that's going to cause subsidence most likely, because you're going to de-water some of the old organic soils. At least the risk will be much higher of that. So it's better to have lots of very shallow pumping than to have a few deeper pumping wells.
Interesting. Yeah, let me see if we have any other questions.
I have a question, Ash.
And Ray, she has a question.
So thinking about the wicket model that on that slide, I haven't seen anything on that. Maybe I've missed it or overlooked it, but have you seen anything in the States where we are saying, this is now, we need to be starting these things? Because I'm thinking about planning processes and how long it takes to do even just a pilot project. It takes years. So you get the pilot project installed, but if we've got these big challenges and the clock's ticking at, let's say, a 20-year timeline to get these in, is that something you're seeing local planners being aware of and moving on?
I think the people who are advocating for pilot projects, people like Roger Leventhal in Marin County, have really successfully advocated for pilot projects. They are anxious and really, really want to try stuff. And BCDC and other public agencies are trying to adjust to keep up. But as public agencies have lost funding, they've lost capacity to evaluate innovations.
Right.
So we really need to support them either with, consultants or with more staff. They're being asked to do something new. And meanwhile, their budgets have all been slashed. They're running on skeleton crews in many cases. So it may not sound like a great thing, but we really need to support those public agencies. Otherwise, they can't evaluate the pilots and they can't responsibly make choices.
Thanks, that's helpful.
Yeah.
I've allowed the audience, if you guys have questions, you can raise your hand and unmute. I took off the unmute restrictions.
Let me close my slides here because it seems like it's a little bit of a distraction. One risk we're looking at in the interior of the Bay Area is thinking about toxics in soil and how that's going to become a problem, in addition to just nutrients going to the bay as groundwater draws those nutrients out of the new elevations in the soil and brings them back with the ebb tide. So it's nutrients and all kinds of toxic pollutants that are part of the mix. And we really have to strategize about which ones to completely remove, because can you imagine trying to maintain all those, slurry walls or whatever it is we try to use in perpetuity? it just does not seem a good fit for American public culture.
Yeah, the Netherlands, I think we probably have we do have a lot to learn from the Netherlands because they're basically a country that's underwater.
Yes, but they have no earthquakes and they're terrible about biodiversity. So when they come out to consult in California, take it all with a big grain of salt and make sure that you're thinking about seismic and biodiversity. It's not their expertise.
Let's see. I think I got a question that came in to me as a message from Leslie, my colleague, and she said, "What are your thoughts about natural adaptation projects being piloted for Tomales Bay?" Yeah, we have. You talked a little bit about Stinson, and they are looking at some different. The study I mentioned just came out with some different nature-based solutions there, but for Tomales Bay, so it seems that they might not necessarily protect against erosion, but will not offer protection in the long term as we're walled in by hills. So I don't know, I might not be saying that clearly, but does that make sense? We're kind of wondering about options for Tomales Bay and potential pilots out there.
You know, I think that one possibility is to use the road. I'm trying to remember which road it is, the one that goes at the bottom of Tomales Bay, between Point Reyes Station and then the west side of the bay, to use that road as a levee. And to think of that whole area as a
If you
horizontal
just saw
levee.
the recording button, if you do not want to be recorded.
So that would be one option, is to, think about taking that channel out that currently provides recreational access in that area, and shallowing, that's the word for filling when you're doing it for habitat purposes and biodiversity, we call it shallowing. Shallowing that whole area around White House Pool and bringing up a wetland to the edge of the roadway there, across that whole southern edge of the bay. That might be one strategy that would help protect that landscape for longer. But as I said, groundwater will still come up behind that area to the south of that road, even if you raise it. But it would protect the road for longer. So I hope that living shorelines are a part of the mix. But as my colleague Mark Stacy says, who's chair of civil engineering at Cal, wetlands are a retreat strategy, because eventually you have to move inland or continue adding sediment to your wetland. And there aren't many good ways yet to add that sediment without killing the plants, at least locally. So we're trying to figure out how to raise wetlands now while we mimic the way that sediment would have been deposited in a natural system, thinking about how it would have come from bluffs or rivers. So we're trying to think of creative ways to keep the wetlands growing higher, but it's not easy. It is worth it for the next 20 to 40 years. And then we have to make other choices in those pathways.
David has a question. Let's see, can you unmute? Should be able to unmute. Okay, I think you're unmuted now.
Yeah, quick question about the wetlands, because they seem so important. You mentioned wetlands are a retreat approach, but I guess they could be a growth approach, as you also said. What's the relative time frame for a growing wetland compared to the expected rate of rise of the water ocean? And can we expect that a wetland might grow, or is that completely impossible with the rate of rise that you predict?
There are some places in the South Bay where there's enough sediment in the water column that wetlands may be able to keep up. But they're not many. Those are the exceptions rather than the rule. And one possibility is, I showed you the slide of the sand engine where they piled up a lot of sand and let the waves move it around. One possibility is that we might try a silt engine, where we would do a berm of silt off the toe of the wetland and let the tide carry it up onto the surface of that wetland. So that might be a way to mimic natural processes.
And where would the silt come from?
We'd have to get that silt from somewhere. And it's a good question where all of this material is going to come from. We know we don't have enough of the sands and gravels and silts that we'd like to use. So it's a good question where they'll come from. Probably old clay soils in other parts of the Bay Area that are dry. That's one possible source.
Thank you.
Thanks, David. Yeah, there's a lot of things to consider with sediment, and then it has to be clean and it has to be the right size and type. And
And we're very picky here in California. In Louisiana, they're not picky. They just get the clamshell dredge out there and grab it, pile it up somewhere else.
right. Each state has its own challenges, for better or worse. Let's see, Lena said, I really appreciate how you've described the real situation we're in today, terrifying but hopeful with people like you who are thinking through the options. So yeah.
It is amazing how the human sense of time, we invented these things called clocks, and they're so regular. And so in our minds, I think we imagine that change will be regular. But this change is exponential, and that's very hard for humans to get their heads around. What does that mean? We see it coming very, very slowly, and then it seems like overnight, the rate increases dramatically. And that's what I worry about, that we're not going to take it seriously now. We're going to wait, and then it's going to seem to hit us like a disaster, and we'll all be saying, well, how could we have known? But we know now.
That's a very, very good point, and perhaps a good ending point. Unless, does anyone else have a burning question? Any hands raised? Let's see. I think we can probably wrap up, but I want to thank you so much, Kristina. This has been such an informative presentation, and really just it gets us thinking about all the different options and things we have to consider, and really how complex these problems are, and the fact that we do need to act as soon as possible.
Great. And the rest of California is counting on you all in West Marin to be leaders on this, because there aren't a lot of leaders stepping up. So we really hope that your creativity and your knowledge of your landscape is going to lead us to some good pilot projects. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.